Yeah, first off, before we start, please note we were able to run off some copies of the Children Armed Conflict Report, so there's some copies at the back. So please take a second. You can have the copies and start looking over them, and then Virginia Gamba will talk to you, and we can take some questions. But first, please. We had wanted, I mean, this is meant to go online, this report, but for whatever reason, there seems to have been a little bit of a glitch, and it wasn't posted promptly this morning as we had expected. It should be posted sometime, so you'll also be able to see it on the website fairly soon. Having said that, good morning, everyone. We're very pleased to have with us today the Secretary General's Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict, Virginia Gamba, whom you know well. And it's the time of year when you know why she is here to talk to you. The report on children in armed conflict has been published as a document today. There are some copies available, so you can have a look at it. And Ms. Gamba will now talk to you about some of the main points of this year's report, and then she'll take your questions. Ms. Gamba, over to you.
Which one do I?
Oh,
okay, it's late.
You're awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. And apologies again, we did have a glitch. The intention was to have it up at 8, so you would have time to read it before this meeting. So I really apologize. My people are in the back. If you would like afterwards for them to give you the email, and then you can send questions once you have time to read the report, they'll be happy to transmit them to me, because it's unfair on you. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So let me start by some of the highlights of the report. As you know, the report covers the year 2022. Just for you to know, the open debate under the presidency of the United Kingdom will occur on the 5th of July in the Chamber of the Security Council. I think while the past month have shown escalation with existing conflicts, as you all know, this report only covers the reporting period, which is from January to December 2022. As always, any subsequent events will be reported next year. There is one caveat for you to know. The report does cover, mostly in the development and concern sections, any mention of any engagement that with the parties to conflict that was commenced in 2022, and the status of that engagement goes all the way, let's say, even to May. And that's just to keep track on the engagements in that section. In 2022, children continued to be disproportionately affected by armed conflict. We had 27,180 grave violations against 18,890 children. About 2/3 of them boys, 1/3 girls, a little bit more than 1/3 girls. We covered 24 situations and 1 regional monitoring agreement, the Lake Chad Basin, as had been agreed 2 years ago. The lack of respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law had a devastating impact on the protection of children in armed conflict, which resulted in a dire year for children living in situations affected by armed conflict. Therefore, over 18,890 children have been affected at least by one of the 4 individual violations. You know, we have a mix, 4 individual violations, 2 collective violations. The individual ones are recruitment and use, killing and maiming, rape, and other forms of sexual violence and abduction. We're also able to say that at least 2,330 of these children were victims of 2 or more of the 6 grave violations. This is tragic, yet crucial information to have, as this confirms that grave violations are often interlinked. For example, a boy may be abducted and then recruited to fight and end up maimed or killed on the front line. A girl may be recruited to be used, then is raped, and end up killed in an attack on the camp where she is being held. This reinforces the importance to work on the prevention of grave violations and the provision of holistic reintegration support for all children affected by conflict. When we add the number of incidents of attacks on schools and hospitals and the denial of humanitarian access, which are the two collective grave violations against children, the number of grave violations reaches more than 27,000. Again, this is only verified information. I want to remind that these numbers are based on the Monitoring Reporting Mechanism Verification Standard, which is proper to the Children and Armed Conflict mandate and differs from others such as human rights monitoring. Countries that recorded the highest numbers of grave violations in 2022 were the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Israel and the State of Palestine, Somalia, Ukraine, and Syria, while the countries that faced the worst deterioration were Myanmar, South Sudan, and Burkina Faso. The most prevalent violation in 2022 was killing and maiming, with more than 8,600 children killed or maimed. This was followed by recruitment and use of children with more than 7,600, and abduction with more than 3,900. The sharpest increase of the year is on attacks on schools and hospitals, showing a 112% increase from previous years, a staggering 1,846 schools and hospitals were attacked. Rape and other forms of sexual violence registered 1,166 verified violations, but we know this is vastly underreported. Despite not being a listable violation, the denial of humanitarian access remained very high, with 3,931 incidents verified by the United Nations. One wonders if this was a listable violation, whether this would be a lower figure. Although not a grave violation, the widespread military use of schools by both armed forces and armed groups during 2022 is again a very worrisome trend. Schools and hospitals should remain zones of peace. When they are not, they can become targets during fighting between parties to conflict, and children become part of this tragedy. Furthermore, the number of children detained remained high this year again, but decreased in compared to previous years, with 2,496 children deprived of liberty for alleged association with parties to conflict. I would like to remind that the detention of children should only be used as a last resort and for the shortest period. Alternatives to detention should be actively sought and reintegration support provided. Children should not be doubly punished by conflict. What are the changes to the report this year? In Ukraine, the Secretary General decided to list the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups under Section B of Annex 2 for attacks on schools and hospitals and for killing of children, in particular through the use of explosive weapons with a wide impact area, including shelling from heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and airstrikes in populated areas, which resulted in a very high number of casualties and the destruction of infrastructures. The Russian Federation and affiliated armed groups have been listed under Section B of Annex 2 in consideration of the ongoing engagement they had with me since last year and also following my visit to Russia in May. I am committed to continue this engagement to make sure that measures identified to end and prevent children from grave violations are being implemented. And I note that decreases in these two violations have already started to occur as soon as my engagement commenced in August 2022 to date. The Secretary General decided to also warn the Ukrainian armed forces in Section 5, owing to the high number of children killed and maimed and of attacks on schools and hospitals attributed to them. While we are aware that Ukraine's military actions are in response of Russia's aggression, the CAC mandate applies to all parties to conflict and whether grave violations are committed during offensive or defensive operations. The warning serves to remind Ukraine of the importance to uphold international humanitarian law and international human rights law going forward. The Secretary General will remain attentive to the way Ukrainian forces respond to his request, but I commend already the progress made by the Ukrainian government in taking further steps in protecting children as soon as my engagement with them began last year. In Israel and the State of Palestine, the Secretary General did not list any parties to the conflict. Last year, in his annual report, the Secretary General stated explicitly that, and I quote, should substantial airstrikes and rockets resulting from the May 2021 escalation of hostilities repeat itself in 2022, parties to the conflict should be listed. End of quote. The Secretary General also called on parties to the conflict to engage with me to identify practical measures to protect children and end grave violations. Following my visit to Israel and the State of Palestine, of course Gaza and Ramallah and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, engagement took place with all parties, including through an exchange of letters, the appointment of focal points by all parties, and the identification of practical measures, including those proposed by the United Nations to end and prevent grave violations against children. We also noted an important decrease in airstrikes by Israeli forces from 598 airstrikes in 2021 to 52 in 2022. The whole purpose of the CAC mandate as given by the Security Council is to engage with parties to create a change in the behavior of parties and strengthen the protection of children. Nonetheless, I am concerned by the continuing high level of grave violations against children, particularly the increasing level of violence in the occupied West Bank, including in East Jerusalem in 2023. Therefore, I will continue my engagement with the parties in order to make sure that the identified measures to end and prevent violations against children are being implemented. Additionally, the Secretary General decided to list the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara under Section A of Annex 2 for the killing and maiming of children in Burkina Faso. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Mouvement du 23 Mars has been listed under Section A of Annex 1 for killing and maiming, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, attacks on schools and hospitals, and abduction. This is the group that recently has also raided the school in Uganda. My Zaire has been listed under Section A of Annex 1 for the killing and maiming of children. Twiguanejo has been listed under Section A of Annex 1 for recruitment and use of children. Some parties previously listed had additional violations added to their listings. In Burkina Faso, because of an increase of attacks on schools and hospitals, Yama Nusrat ul Islam wal Muslimin has been listed under Section A of Annex 2 for this violation. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Allied Democratic Forces have been listed under Section A of Annex 1 for rape and other forms of sexual violence. The Coopérative pour le Développement du Congo, CODECO, has been listed under Section A of Annex 1 for the abduction of children. In Myanmar, the Myanmar Armed Forces have been listed under Section A of Annex 1 for attacks on schools and hospitals and abduction, following an increase in these violations. Therefore, today they sit with 5 violations under their name. We also had some delisting, not much, but some delisting in the report. In Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces have been delisted for the violation of recruitment and use of children owing to a decrease in this grave violation attributed to them and the signature of an action plan to prevent the recruitment and use of children. I will be following this with a personal visit in November. Additionally, India has been removed from the agenda of CAC, following concrete engagement with my office over the last 2 years. In Yemen, the security-belt forces were moved from Annex 1A to Annex B in recognition for their willingness to sign the existing action plan with the Yemen Armed Forces, and because they are embedded in the Yemen Armed Forces, today figure as state forces and not non-state actors. Finally, I want to highlight that the Secretary General has taken the decision to include 2 new situations of concern in the CAC agenda. These are Haiti and Niger. To summarize, despite some progress, children have continued to suffer the consequences of man-made conflict in 2022. But this is not a time to give up. We need to redouble efforts and ensure that we have the resources and support to continue to monitor and report grave violations, provide capacity building, and pursue accountability and prevent all grave violations against children. Because of the word count, our report contains, unfortunately, very limited examples of the suffering of children. We have published today, there are some copies in the back, at the same time as the report, a summary document which includes additional information such as comparisons, information on gender, and individual stories for each grave violations, as well as a useful map for you to have. It is an invitation to look beyond the numbers, and I invite you to have a look at it. Finally, I would like to remind us all that military operations set in motion due to rebellions, offensives, and counteroffensives have led to an increased use of explosive weapons, including with wide impact in populated areas, which resulted in an outrageous number of children being killed and maimed, and a striking increase of schools and hospitals being damaged, denying children education and access to health services. I remind that all parties to conflict are bound by the principles of impartiality, proportionality, distinction, and humanity as per international humanitarian law, and should be at the heart of all military planning and action. Civilian populations, and particularly children, are paying the price of armed conflict. We need to reconsider the value of peace for the sake of our children. Thank you, and I am ready to take some questions.
And before we proceed, I also want to let you know that the good news is that the document is now online, so you can access it off the UN website. I'll turn it over to questions. Yes, James.
On behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, thank you for doing this. James Bayes, Al Jazeera. So I want to press you a bit on why Israel is not listed. You read that quote from last. Could you just read that again, that one line that you read from last year's report?
Should substantial airstrikes and rockets resulting from the May 2021 escalation of hostilities repeat itself in 2022, parties to the conflict should be listed.
So I don't understand why Israel is not listed. There was another conflict in Gaza in 2022. The total number of deaths is less because the conflict in May 2021 was 11 days long. The conflict in August 2022 was 3 days long. But Israel did exactly the same thing. It fired indiscriminately, bombed indiscriminately, and killed children. I don't understand why you don't list them. You made a clear warning, and then you wimped out.
I think it has to do with both the engagement and the numbers. There were specific requests in Section 5 of last year, which was to engage on prevention efforts by all 3 parties to conflict: Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Israel forces. That engagement did occur, and by December, all sides had agreed to exchange letters with me with the provision of certain measures that they were willing to start putting into place as soon as the new year started.
But letters don't save children's lives. You know what's going on this year. I know this only covers 2022. Israel's already killed 27 children this year.
Well, this is why we're very worried. As we said, we're very concerned at an escalation that we're noticing this year. But for last year, we have to recognize that between 2021 and 2022, there was a decrease in both the killing and the maiming of children. The killing of children was halved between 78 to 42 last year. And like I said, the airstrikes reduced from 598 to 52. With these figures, the Secretary General had to stay true to his word.
But I still don't understand. They are still killing children in huge numbers. Really, dreadful the figures are. Just because the figures in 2021 were more dreadful because the war lasted slightly longer. And I know your report is only supposed to be for 2022, but you have the benefit of knowing what is coming, and you could have sent a clear warning, a clear signal to Israel that might have saved children's lives by putting them on the list.
I think we have to give time for the measures that we have agreed, both sides have agreed to implement this year are put in place.
So
And
we'll give them time, shall we, and just let more children die in the meantime?
I don't think that's a very fair comment. I think what is fair is that never before have all three parties agreed to put their signature behind measures to be put in place to reduce and mitigate the results of these violations against children. So I think we'll just have to wait and see.
Joe?
Yeah, Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. Just want to get a little more granular here in defining the age range that encompasses the children that you are reporting about. Because, again, in your discussion about Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank, you seem to lump all children together as killed and maimed by Israeli forces during law enforcement operations by the use of live ammunition, without acknowledging that there have been substantial reports of Palestinian militants going down to the ages of as young as 13 who were engaged in the violence, shooting, stabbing, and so forth. So they were not innocent bystanders. So I'm wondering to what extent you were able to drill down to see whether and distinguish between children who were innocent civilians versus those who were actually perpetrators and were involved in the exchange of gunfire that occurred, for example, in the West Bank.
Well, this is something that is in a way at the heart of our mandate. For us, the definition of a child is from 0 to 18 years old. And a child is a child is a child, including when they are perpetrators of violence. This is why when we talk about the best principles on detention or the privation of liberty of anyone between 0 and 18, this is why we advocate very much against things like the death penalty for perpetrators that are children in some situations, like recently in Somalia, in Puntland, where 4 of them were sentenced to death. We say a child is a child. They should be put through juvenile courts. They should be tried as children when they're found to have been guilty. We cannot make a distinction between children that are fighting against armed forces. We think it's regrettable. We understand the situation. We've had this in many situations. We've had this in Yemen because we've had this very much in Afghanistan as well, where the Taliban were known for large numbers of recruitment and use of under 18-year-olds. So for us, a child is a child is a child. A violation will be recorded, even if it's the killing, maiming, or detention of a child that is found guilty of some type of violence or perpetration of an act. There are and there is information in the annual report at times. Like I said, we have a problem with the word count that specifies if a child was maimed when that child was in the course of attacking with a knife somebody. So we do try to give some nuance to this.
Wouldn't it have been helpful to at least acknowledge in the paragraph where you're mostly criticizing Israel for carrying out law enforcement operations, to also note that they were met with rounds and rounds of gunfire from Palestinian militants that included children who were recruited. I know you make a general reference about recruitment, but don't you think in the context here that there should have been acknowledged about the dangers to children, again, going down as low as 13 or maybe even younger,
yes,
who were recruited or who, on their own volition, put themselves in danger by participating in the exchange of fire and so forth?
I think, I know you received the report very late, but I really entrust that you will read all the paragraph from 85 to 100 that refer to Israel and Palestine, and you will see there are paragraphs appropriate for Israel, which are recommendations for Israel, but there is also paragraph appropriate to the Palestinian groups, particularly the PAG and Hamas, but also Palestinian authorities, on what is expected of them. And if it's any help in the measures that we have agreed, they are, as you know, confidential. Whenever we sign a joint action plan or there is an exchange of letters on measures agreed by both parties, I really worked very much on the issue of non-recruitment and use of children below 18 from both Hamas and PIJ. I also, for example, asked that no ammunition or weapons would be ever stored in any tunnel, let's say, underneath a school in Gaza, or be placed in such a way that any returning fire would invariably hit children. On the other hand, with Israel, there are mentions in the report already of the many activities and actions that they're prepared to undertake. Perhaps some of the more representative actions that they are prepared to undertake is to revise the standard rules or aggregate specific rules of engagement in special operations that would govern the use of live ammunition when the targets are suspected minors. Also, we worked very hard in trying to speed up the granting of medical permits of almost 3,000 violations attributed, or 1,800 violations attributed to Israel, are delays in the granting permits for children to leave Gaza for medical treatment. And in some cases, this results in death. And so we are working on trying to speed up the process of complying with permits. There are a number of measures that both sides have agreed to do. I have to say, though, I am very concerned, not just at the first 3 months of this year, what we're seeing mostly in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, and we're keeping a very sharp lookout for these issues. I'm very concerned at the increase in the use of firearms by civilian populations. There seems to be an influx of illicit firearms, particularly in that vicinity. There seems to be a use of social media that we cannot get our head around, where children might be incited. And it is not clear who the main inciting agent might be, but I think this is happening. At the same time, there is a very big increase in killing and maiming attributed to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and it's mostly through their redoubling airstrikes, sending rockets out, and these falling short and falling in Palestinian territory in Gaza, and as a result, maiming some children. We are discussing all of these issues, and we will continue to do so. But I think it might be of interest to everybody that what I am personally interested this year is to look at the emergence of new armed groups in this situation. We're trying to keep a very close tab on settlers, and we're trying to keep a very close tab on any other armed group that might be appearing or showing, particularly in the West Bank. Hopefully by the end of the year we'll have more clarity, but we're determined that the measures that have been agreed to be put in place by all three parties be done. You will notice in this annual report that the Secretary General has taken a decision which sits under the section of Israel and Palestine under the developments and concerns. And he has says in paragraph 96, I request that my special representative coordinate with the United Nations the strengthening and broadening of that working group to cover Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. So one of the problems we have with monitoring reporting is the weaknesses of the monitoring reporting working groups. And in this case, the Secretary General took a decision to order its strengthening, which I will start doing now that the report is public. Thank you.
Abdulhamid?
Thank you, Madam Gamba. This is Abdulhamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Last year I asked you if you feel comfortable with this report not listing Israel and if you sleep comfortably at night seeing all these atrocities. Now the situation is worse, okay, as you know. The five major countries who abuse the rights of the children are as follows. First, Palestine and Israel with a 3,133. Second, Somalia. Third, Syria. Fourth, Ukraine. And fifth, Afghanistan. So Israel and Palestine is number one as far as I just skimmed through the report. So that means the most the country that violates the rights of the children and in all categories, as you listed, is Israel. And yet it's not listed. Not even the settlers there are two groups who are listed as terrorist groups. The Guards of the Hills and the Revenge group who are launching all these attacks on Palestine.